So we're reading Gambhir Nanda's Holy Mother, Sri Sharda Devi, and we're on we're on page 2. So last week was it's a great read actually here. So I'll go along. If anybody has something to say or wants to stop for a question or a comment, please do. All right. So not only has the descent of God a particular technique of its own, but the manifestation of his power also has its own mode. Or to put it otherwise, though the time and the purpose are the same for the incarnation of God and his power, which are inseparable like fire and heat, yet the objective is attained through the masculine body in one way and through the feminine in another. Thus it is that even though the entity cannot be split up, there is a special value in following separately the events that accompany the feminine counterpart. And one of those wonderful things that Hinduism or Vedanta brought to my mind was that notion that when God comes, almost always he comes as male and female. That there's always that companion, and it's a beautiful balance. That's sort of the way the world is, with nuance. Because interestingly enough, I'm starting to put together a big study on gender and Sri Ramakrishna, and there's a lot there's a striking amount of nuance in the way that Ramakrishna talks about gender. He goes in one of the places in the gospel, he goes around the room, all of his young men disciples are sitting in there, and he just points at them and he's telling somebody, oh, such and such has a feminine spirit. Oh, such and such has a manly spirit. Oh, such and such is good friends with such and such because he's womanly and he's manly. And he's talking about all men. And so it's quite interesting that he just so matter of factly sees it that way. And quite often in the mythology also of all the world's religions, actually, but you get many of these gods and goddesses who have kind of a definitely a non-binary manifestation, like they're both a man and a woman, or they're able to be both and experience both. And it's quite an interesting approach to that whole thing. And so even in the same person, you can see this mix. If you ever want to do a fun exercise, a little digital exercise one time, take that picture of Sri Ramakrishna that we worship on the shrine, or that's on most shrines anyway, and cut it down the middle and put the two right halves together and the two left halves together. If you do that, you will distinctly see very clearly, without any interpretation necessary at all, that one picture is of a very masculine man and one picture is a very feminine woman. That could just be coincidence, who knows? But Greg did that one time in the monastery in San Francisco for fun, and it was startling. It was like, wow, that's really true. That Thakur really does embody both. But the Divine Mother was the consort, was the feminine coming into the world as an incarnation.
And I mean, especially Swamiji, the concept of whole is also like the Shakti and Shiva together, right? So that is the goal of everyone's life, to become whole.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. To be a balance, even as an individual person, if you're extremely feminine or if you're extremely masculine, it's always good to develop both sides or to own both sides of yourself. You know, I think that feminine spirit is a beautiful temper to the you know the intensity of I don't even know how to talk about these things without getting in trouble. They're good counters to each other. Let's put it that way. It's a good idea for women to work on their masculine side in general, and for men to work on their feminine side in general, because it's really a bell curve, isn't it? I mean, there's all of us are not very few people are fully male, and very few people are fully female. It's like there's that gentle wave, like everything in nature, everything is in a harmony and everything is in a proportion. There's not many extremes in nature. Nature seems to like to mix it up. They like a lot of nature thrives most with lots of diversity. And so it's interesting to see those aspects, especially in today's political climate, to bring these conversations to the table in a way for learning, not in a way of making a point, but always in a way for opening our minds and opening our hearts so that we don't get caught up in wrong thinking, in unkind thinking, unkind actions. Thus it is, even though the entity cannot be split up, there is a special value in following separately the events that accompany the feminine counterpart. In the Chandi, the goddess says, "Whenever there arises any obstacle from the demons, I shall come down in this way to destroy the enemy." In olden times, there was constant need for destroying the demons, as they oppressed good and bad men alike. I don't think that there's any necessary thing to say in olden times anymore. I think we're watching that happen right now in the world, that there's this polarization and things are moving much quicker toward this kind of oppressive or authoritarian approach to things. In olden times, there was a constant need for destroying the demons, as they oppressed good and bad men alike. Their destructive power is not, however, confined to the physical plane. The constant conflict that rages in human hearts between good and evil tendencies is also described in the Upanishads as a battle waged by the demons against the forces of goodness. Yeah, you can actually make an argument, probably a true argument, that the outside world, which questionably exists, many of the sages will say there is no inside and outside world, that there is only the inside, and that which is inside is mirrored in the outside world, and so you see this conflict going on all the time. And even in your own mind, there's this idea that I'm playing with presently, with the notion of Shiva and Shakti, or that being the nature of mind itself. That Brahman in its unchanging aspect is the mind with no thought, the mind perfectly calm, the pure mind. So Ramakrishna says a pure mind, the mind with no particular in it, no me or mine in it, is a pure mind, and that pure mind and Brahman are one. He says they're the same. And the noisy mind, which most of us enjoy or suffer from, is the Shakti. Because it's in the mind alone that creation happens, right? And this is one of my old topics, one of my favorite topics, is that proof that you have no knowledge of an outside world. You cannot validate an outside world. You do not know whether it exists, because, and I'll bring up those examples again, is that when you look at a light bulb, that light never gets to your brain, does it? It goes in the eye and it hits the cones on the back of the eyeball there, and it gets converted into a signal, a neurochemical signal that then goes to the brain. And the brain takes that signal and creates a symbol for light. It's never actually seen the light. It's just gotten information about the light, and so it creates a symbol for that light in your mind. And it's like that for all of your senses. Everything you taste, touch, hear, smell, and whatnot, you're not actually tasting, touching, hearing, smelling those things. You're getting the information of an assumed tasting, touching, hearing, smelling, seeing kind of thing. And the mind is taking that information and creating the world. So you are seeing symbols right now as we look at each other. We're not seeing each other. We are seeing the mind's symbol. We presume through a sense that's connected to the outside world. But the odd thing about that assumption is that we can't verify it. You don't know what the source of sound is. The ear is just as much a symbol of the source of sound as the source of sound would be in the mind. So there's no verifying where the source of your senses is, where it's coming from. And so your mind is the world that you live in. We don't actually live in a world. We actually live in a mind. And so these are very interesting ideas. And so this whole notion of this inner battle, this inner harmony that's trying to be reached, even by the mind, that the mind is trying to find that sattvic state so that it can realize It's the nature, and then transcend completely to pure mind. The constant conflict that rages in human hearts between good and evil tendencies is also described in the Upanishads as a battle waged by the demons against the forces of goodness. In the present age, this struggle has assumed the form of a challenge thrown out by disbelief, materialism, and sensuality to belief in God, faith in the immortality of the soul, and adherence to godliness. It is in consequence of this challenge that there has been a growth of irreligion, envy, enmity, and passion, which are a constant source of war, resulting in the loss of innumerable variable lives. Yeah, so that's even that. Materialism, is the belief in the reality of your senses. It's a belief in the ultimate reality of your senses. So materialism is all for the noisy mind, all for constant thinking and constant gyrations of being, and an identity that's built on top of a mound of thinking, right? Your mind is what contains your ego. Your mind is what contains your karma, and your sense of self is you placing yourself in that mind somewhere. That's your attachment. That's your identity. And the mind is never present. The mind is never in the moment, because the mind is always a few split seconds behind, because it's building its notion of the world off of things that have already happened. And so in the mind, we're always just slightly behind presence. And so that's why presence requires transcending the mind. It requires withdrawing from thought, so that we can experience ourself as ourself, and not as the mind describes ourself to us, which is normally how we do it. The conflict on the psychological plane in the modern age is even more devastating than the old mythological war between the gods and the demons. The old antagonism seldom overstepped the limits of the physical world, but the present struggle has originated in the mental plane and is spreading to all spheres of everyday life, thus laying the axe at the very root of humanity. Hence, the action of the divine power under existing circumstances has to be mainly on the mental plane. Above everything else, the present-day world needs moral progress and spiritual enlightenment. If faith, purity, and devotion can once attain supremacy, the outer world is bound to change. Yeah, and the outer world changes if you change, right? You've had that experience. If you start treating people as your beloved, people start responding to you as your beloved. If you go out and practice kindness, of course, there's always exceptions. Mother keeps things interesting. But in general, you change, the world changes. Of course, that's why, Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world, because that's how it changes. Because of the first fact that we just discussed, you don't live in a world, you live in a mind, and that mind is your mind, and you will arrange it as you want to arrange it. It will be a direct reflection of your notion of yourself, and it will enforce that notion of self, right or wrong. Above everything else, the present-day world needs moral progress and spiritual enlightenment. If faith, purity, and devotion can once attain supremacy, the outer world is bound to change. So those three things, let's talk about those for a moment. Faith. What is faith to you, Nicole?
What is faith to me?
Yeah, what is faith to you?
Oh man, I think it's like the feeling of knowing and being um if it had an action, it's like the byproduct of knowing and being that's already there, because everything seems so familiar, and you like, I don't know, it's just kind of taking it for truth and what things really are, and it just comes without question. um I've been thinking about that lately, how some of us have that by grace, and some of us don't have that faith. But you can have faith. I mean, people have faith in many things, but to have it in God is something that seems to be pretty, I don't know. That's a hard one to put in words. I mean, faith just kind of is. It's
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point.
self-explanatory.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think that works. Faith is giving something a sense of isness, even though you can't necessarily demonstrate it. What I would what the I would make an example of, like, there are certain things that we know which we shouldn't know. Like, for example, the notion of immortality. That requires faith. Why does that require faith? Because there is nothing in the material world that could teach us about immortality. So, in essence, we should not know about immortality. Conceptually, it should not even exist within us, because nothing would have suggested that notion to us. And so faith is to accept something like our immortality because we know of it, though we can't demonstrate it. You know, you can take other things too. There's that notion of immortality. There's the notion of infinity. You know, there is none such thing as infinity in the modern world, or in the physical world at all. And so, where do we get that idea from? You know, where does that come from? We know things that are very large, but why would we take that extra step to infinity? We have nothing to demonstrate that, and yet it's a very familiar concept. You know, and so this idea of our nature, you know, Satchit Ananda, this wisdom, you know, this existence. Existence is an odd thing. You don't really know what it is, right? It's one of the things that I enjoy thinking about quite a bit, and actually have found a great deal of happiness in the idea of existence. It seems to generate its own bliss when you contemplate it. It's something you won't be able to really define. It's like, what does it mean? You know, what I know I exist, but what is it that I know that I call existence? What is it? The experiencing? Is it awareness of awareness? Is it just awareness? You know, what is it? I think that my conclusion is that plain awareness is Brahman, is divine. Awareness of awareness is the devotee. You know, so that we actually become the devotee, or we become that duality to God, by being aware of awareness. And so, or the other way of talking about it is, God is the noun, right? The unchanging absolute. And you are the verb to that noun. You are the verb of God. You are the expression of God. And so these things take some faith, because they're things that you're not going to be able to prove. You know, when Ramakrishna would go into samadhi, that's something he's not going to be able to show you. It's a purely subjective experience. It happens within, if it happens, you know, this is where language starts coming apart for us. That it has to be taken on faith. You know, now of course there's a large number of men and women that have had this experience, or that have seen something along the lines of this divinity. But for the rest of us, there's that gap of assumption that has to be crossed. We have to think, well, gosh, a lot of people are experiencing this. I certainly have not. And yet it's required, right? And so you have to have faith in a few things. You have to have faith in God as love. You have to have faith in God as mercy, or as grace. You have to have faith in this divine principle of everything working together for good. You know, that everybody comes home in the end, that everybody reaches the goal. And why is that faith necessary? That faith is necessary because you're holding on to a branch called the ego, and you have to let go of that. And without that ego, you have no sense of self. There's nothing there for you to land on. So something has to give you that courage. Something has to give you that impetus to be willing to let go of the only thing that you know, in order to touch the divine, right? So if there's more of this faith, more of this ideal of trust in the nature of things being love, the nature of things being wisdom, more faith in the ideas of immortality and our own infinity, he's talking about that being better in the world because it gives meaning to things. It gives profundity to things. If we live in a material world, there is nothing that makes you valuable. You're just a parasite. You eat living things until you're so old that you die. How do we build a respect for each other in that light? You go to work and you make money and you spend it on enjoyments, on food, on shelter, and that's it. Where is the reason to care? Where is the reason to empathize? Without the divine, without the notion of humanity as sourced in love and sourced in wisdom, within the context of an infinite and immortal divine, without that, there's not much reason or motivation to develop that love and respect. There's not really much reason not to just go and take as much as you can before you die. And that's the problem with the modern world, is it's not so much people taking, it's the fact that life loses its point, loses that depth, that wonder, that beauty. So that faith is what he's talking about there, that kind of faith. And what was the second one here?
Swamiji, I was thinking that can we
Yes.
use like a faith and trust as interchangeable? Like for me, like sometimes like when you were asking what faith is, that came for me is like a trust. So is this like I was just wondering.
Yes, faith begets trust, right? I wouldn't, on the spot, I wouldn't say that they're equivalent, because trust definitely signifies other, and the ultimate reality is one, whereas faith can be a thing in and of itself. It doesn't require necessarily other. That's a weak argument, but it's that's my first reaction to it. But yeah, I think they're very closely related. If you know one, you know the other.
No,
Absolutely.
I agree with you. Trust means like I'm trusting someone, something, right? So it's like other is involved there. Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah.
faith is like very open. Faith is like unknown. You are trusting the unknown or something. I don't know.
Yeah. And Swamiji talks about that. He says that, in the old world, that what did he say? In the old world, the atheist had no faith in God. He says in modern times, the atheist is the man who has no faith in himself. So he turns faith in on itself. And so that's the notion. So having this faith in yourself, the faith in your own nature as love, the faith in your own nature as gracious, as wise, as forgiven, that there is a perfect self at the seed, in the seed of you, that anything that has been degraded is purely fictitious, purely an imagination, that you are pure, you are ever free, you are ever beloved. And I think that, yeah, definitely those are the things that he wants us to live with, because they will, in fact, uh, make the world a better experience for everybody there. All right. So the next one he talks about is purity.
Sorry, can
Anybody
I
want
ask
to?
another question on that?
Oh, please. Yes, yes.
So does faith come from surrender?
Yes, oh, absolutely. Wow. Yeah, I think so. Well, it's a loop. I think the more that you surrender, the more you're able to, the more truth becomes apparent in your faith through surrender. As you let go of your ego, you don't find that there's nothing there. You find that there's this ocean of bliss beneath it that has no particular. You find the truth. So yes, you're absolutely. I would think that they're very closely related. One leads to the other. One allows the other to be real. One causes you to discover. So that surrendering, yeah.
I mean, it almost seems like without surrender, it's hard to have faith.
Yeah, or vice versa, or vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa, right?
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. It's they're a which isn't surprising that they would be a what do they call that? A feedback loop until unity is achieved. Yeah, definitely. So that faith is what allows you to surrender, and that surrender strengthens your faith because as you let go and find out that you don't, you're not suffering for it, you're not you're not going bad places for it, then your faith gets increased and you surrender more. And so, absolutely, nice insight. That's nice. All right, the second one here is purity. Anybody want to take a stab at purity? What is purity? What's he going for?
A clean mind and heart. That goes to the string of thought I was having with um the senses being the gates of the soul. Is that correct?
Senses being the gates of the soul.
I was
I
in the
don't know what that
Philokalia.
means.
Well, I was reading when I was reading the Philokalia, it had mentioned something about that the monk needs to realize that the senses are like the gates to the soul. So
Okay.
if the soul, I was just kind of like thinking, going back to like the Garden of Eden, if I could do that, like the fall
Hmm.
of man, where it seems like that's where ego was born, the
Hmm.
separation from the I, and it had to go out from the senses. So the soul's one, and the senses are these gates where you leave the garden and you want to touch and you want to know and you want to taste and you want to smell. So at that point, you become other. Um, so it's almost like in that space of oneness, there's no thought, there's no action, it just is. And it doesn't have words. You can't it's self illuminating. So you can't talk there. But the purity is like that one that sense of oneness that is. But for us as humans, the action involved is with the surrender. It's like the broom that sweeps out the mind and that sweeps out the heart. And it's a spontaneous place, but purity would be without desire, without, I mean, it's pure light. I don't know,
Hmm.
purity's
Yeah, no,
clean.
you're dancing right around it. You're dancing, you're going to dance right into it in a second. What if we say that purity is the lack of me and mine?
Yeah.
If you can clear the mind of the ideas of me and mine, you have a pure mind.
Yeah.
Without the ideas of me and mind, the mind is not agitated. The mind is not disturbed because it's in balance. It's purely the idea of being separate and apart from everything else that causes the disturbance in the mind. And that separate and apart from everything else is caused by defining yourself by the senses and not by that which is before the senses, that which is before the mind. It's the idea of putting several thoughts together and standing on top of it as if it's you, you know? And so, pure mind, the mind with no me or mine, is a silent mind. And a silent mind is Brahman, its realization. So, this purity
Um,
is lack of selfishness. So, if we could have a world lacking in selfishness, where our first notion was not me and mine, it would be a better world, to be a kinder world for sure. And so he says, Ili Chiaro, that Romanian mystic, he really drives it home. He says, your ego self, the reason we want the death of the ego is because it is purely selfish. And you think, wait a minute, I'm not purely selfish. And yet, in your world that you create in your mind, all of the objects of your world are stored in your mind, and every one of those objects has a string tied to you as its relationship, how it relates to you. So you are the center of your world as long as you are in ego space. You decide everything. Your whole world surrounds you and you alone and exists for you and you alone. So in our ego state, we could not be alarmed enough about having an ego. You know, it's not a pretty thing at all. We're very defensive about it because we don't want to say, oh, I'm a terrible person. And we shouldn't say we're a terrible person, but we should know that if we think we are the ego self, if we think that we're separate and apart from the whole, we aren't. We are a terrible person. It's just that everybody else is too, and we sort of get along that way, and we just, make do when we live in this world. But if we could get rid of that notion of having everything be related only to me, and this idea of me as the center of my world, if that was eliminated, if we could come up with that purity, that's what a Jesus is. That's what a Rama is. That's what a Krishna is, a Buddha. They are these individuals that even have given up the pronouns for themselves. Ramakrishna would talk about himself as this place. Sri Nisargadatta would say, somebody asked, well, what are you? And he would say, oh, this is just a place where things happen. So these great souls, they don't have a will-driven, egocentric space. They are the observer, and they see God. They experience the divine, through the senses. And that's really what the senses were for. Let's just say that. The senses were for living in paradise, in the company and presence of the beloved, in a sense of perfect harmony. There wasn't perfect unity. Of course, we can't talk about these things because it's so other, but even in the Garden of Eden, before Adam and Eve went out through the senses to appreciate that fruit, that forbidden fruit, and then to decide that it was, one, it was beautiful, and two, that it looked like it would be good to eat, and three, that it would give them wisdom and make them like God. That was the 3-step fall, right? So that Garden of Eden is within us, not metaphorically, really. That paradise is within us. And we are constantly doing, in a circular cycle sort of way, we are constantly doing what Eve did. We're going out through our senses and we're looking at that fruit and we're thinking, ooh, that's beautiful. And if we stop there, that's how it should be. We assign that beauty to the divine. We enjoy that beauty as beauty. We know we have no need for more of it. We have no need to own it. We have no need to take it in. We just let it be what it is. Everything would be fine. But if you go to step 2 and say, that looks like it would be good food. It'd be good to take, to own, to give, to be part of me. So then we reach for it. We go grabbing, which in the Buddhist world, that's the fundamental problem. We have this grabbing nature. And then our third thing was that it would make her like God. It would make her whole. It would make her complete. And so this life, this egoistic world, is about seeing beauty, wanting it for yourself, and believing that you will be made happy or complete or whole by taking it in. And that illustrates the curse of God, because now you have to go to work for 8 to 10 hours every single day to do what? To pay for all the things that you're grabbing and hoping will make you happy and make you whole. And as long as you live under that delusion of being a sensual self and not being a spiritual self, you're just on the treadmill. You'll spend the days of your life scratching at the dust of the earth for your food, the Lord says. And so that's where the curse of the garden comes from. And we're experiencing that every day. But in reality, we are not that. We're ever free, ever pure, ever beloved. We do not need the things of the senses. We can accept their beauty. Beauty is a quality of God. So we can use them to worship. We can use them as love, even in that slight sense of separation for the sake of conversation. But in reality, Eve finds her way back into the garden. I talk about this too much, but it's such an exciting idea to me that we can find our way back into the garden by what? By defeating the cherubim with the flaming sword. And what's that flaming sword? Desire. This hunger of living in the senses produces in us constant desire. We can't return to Eden. We can't return to the paradise within until we come up with a firm faith in the fact that we do not need these things. We will not be filled by the world and its senses, that we're already full, that we are already like God. We were created like God. We are that image, that reflection of God. Nothing needs to be done in that sense. And so that's purity. That's the return to the garden. That's how we make it back home again, by coming to our own fulfillment simply by definition. And that takes
So,
faith.
so
Uh-huh.
bhakti is so in regards to bhakti, because the knowledge is there, but the bhakti won't go away, and it's like seeing God in everything and everyone, and from that place, whatever happens to this soul, if it gets eaten up completely, that's fine. It's God's will, but it's hard to not desire to be in this body alive, because when you realize you now realize that you can use those senses to enjoy God. I mean, he existed like this because he wanted to, I guess. I mean, God exists because he wanted to. It was his will that he's here. So it's hard not to just want to eat that, and not for just, you know, myself. It just seems the natural way of the order of things, and it just so happens to be pleasurable to love God, you know.
Uh-huh.
It's
Yeah. There's
pretty
not an absolute, there's not, well, there is an absolute truth to that, but Ramakrishna gives us permission for both. He actually gives us a paradigm where both of those are true. He says there are some people who want to eat sugar. They don't want to be sugar. So he's saying those people, you can. You can worship Ramakrishna and go to Ramakrishna Loka, and you can eat sugar. You can sit there and enjoy the divine presence of God and be separate. Now, people say, or it has been said, that at the end of the Yuga, everything gets gathered back up into unity, and even those people who are enjoying Thakur in Thakur Loka are going to be brought into the one without a second again. But Ramakrishna also says that there are places in this ocean where the ice never melts, where the ice is eternal, where God with form is there. So what do we do with that? Those are two paradigms. We just say yes to both of them and just say that it's beyond our understanding of the world, because we live in the material world. It's beyond our understanding to know how those two can be true. It's very much like one of my favorite things that Thakur says in the Great Masters when he's describing about when he comes down from, I don't know, wherever that is. He was in in the unity, in the place where there is no distinction, there is no separation, and he crosses a wall into the this world, and he sees the seven rishis in deep meditation. He goes up to Vivekananda, who's one of those rishis, and says, I'm going down. And he falls down like a star, and in few moments later, Vivekananda follows him and comes down. So there's a couple of things about that. Ramakrishna comes from the place of the indivisible, and he does it by crossing a wall. do you see the delight in that? He's in the realm of the indivisible, and he crosses a wall. So the indivisible is in fact divided by a wall. And so he comes over to the other side. So what he's saying there is that he's not lying to us or anything. There's just things that are, it's like talking about calculus to a kindergartner. You're going to have to make up some stories and put some pretty pictures up there and make it very, very palatable, and they still won't understand it, but they'll be able to talk about it. And that's kind of our situation. So yes, you're right. In one sense, the ultimate truth is one without a second. But within that one without a second, Thakur has given an allowance for an eternal relationship with a God that is in fact separate from the devotee. So both of them are true. Both of them are possible. How it works, we can talk to Thakur or Ma later, as we,
Swamiji, may I say something?
Please, yes.
Purity can also be expressed as being untouched, like the lotus,
Okay.
Slush and mud, and it does not take on the dirt or does not are centered. We are with, I mean, it is the self within us that if we can remain centered, then we are
Yes,
we are in this Leela, but
oh, there we go.
we are not of the world. We remain pure because purity is also, and I mean, it's not contaminated by any influences, judgments. So I don't know if I'm able to express myself, but
No, I think you're doing it. It's hard because you're breaking up quite a bit on my speaker anyway.
I
But
know this, my internet always is not too stable. I've tried. We have
yeah,
Cox here in Southern California, and
oh,
several
gosh, even in
times we've
Southern
called them
California.
and it just sorry.
No worries, no worries. I think you're right. I think though that both definitions have the same root. Uh, if the way we remain stainless like the lotus in this world is by knowing our nature and knowing the nature of things of the senses.
Mhm.
And by knowing the nature of the things of the senses, they can't stick to us because we know their place. We know that it's the knowing that there's nothing there for me to take into myself, for me to get dirty with, you know. Uh, but yes, I definitely think that's probably a better working definition, or one that we can actually certainly work on in more incremental ways to know it that way than to know it simply as the absence of me and mine, which is like hitting Advaita immediately without having anything to work with. So I think it's a good perspective, and I think it's a helpful one. So yeah, I think you're right in that sense. That's how it manifests. Purity is that nothing sticking, everything being in its place, because you know your nature, and because you know the senses can't feed you. You know, the Gita says nothing can be added to your soul, nothing can be taken away from it. And oh, Nicole, I wanted to talk about that idea too of the soul. You know, it's helpful to think of the soul. It's because Atman, the soul, is used in many different ways and can look many different ways. Like it looks like we each have our own soul, right? It seems like that. The ultimate reality, they say, the way that I've come to think of it is if you have a dish towel, take a dish towel and call that dish towel the soul. There's only one, okay? Then put your left hand underneath that dish towel, and put a rubber band over the dish towel over each one of your fingers. And now you've got 5 souls within the world, 5 individuated souls. But when they come to realization, that rubber band is popped off, right? And that soul is no longer separate. So in the grand scheme of things, Vivekananda says that there's one soul, which is God. God is that, right? But God has become each one of us through this idea of separateness, which comes from ego, which comes from a localized mind and use of mind to define ourselves as separate based on our senses, based on our body, based on our
Yeah.
experiences and memories. But in the ultimate thing, nothing is destroyed. No souls are destroyed, or no souls are burned up, or even absorbed in the sense of real absorption. What they are is that sense of separateness, that false sense of other, is removed, and they return to that natural state. And yourself is always there, you know, always. Now in this loka that Thakur talks about, apparently it seems to be, for now in my mind anyway, things change as you grow and learn, but my understanding at this point is that there are places, like Thakur says, where the ice never melts. And so you as a soul, you can keep your rubber band and you can live in the presence of your beloved. You know, that rubber band will probably be so thin and so unbinding that the slightest hint on your part that you're done, it just goes. But otherwise, it can hang out there, and you can enjoy your sugar. You can enjoy your love, and that's Takor seems to be making room for that both ways. So it's a beautiful ideal.
Like,
All
I'm
right,
kind
so
of in.
purity.
Swamiji, one more thing.
Uh-huh.
Sorry.
No
Go ahead,
worries.
Nikhil.
Oh
What's
no,
the one
I
more
was.
thing?
You go ahead.
Okay, Swamiji, I just wanted to say that little children are such an example of purity because they have just arrived in this world and they don't have any preconceived notions about likes and dislikes. They haven't yet sort of gone through the process of that or being contaminated. That when you watch them, it's amazing how pure they are. Like they love everybody, whether you're old, young, good looking, not. And it's just so inspiring and teaches you so much just by observing the children's nature.
Mm.
They're just an example of pure love and purity. I don't know how to express. I just know that as I'm growing older, all children are beautiful because they teach you so much. You look through their fresh eyes, and sometimes even books cannot teach you what they can. They're just a living example of life that is fresh, that is new, that is pure.
Yes. No, that's very
And
true.
it's
They
amazing. And I just,
no, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what, that's why Jesus says that quite a few times. I tell you the truth, unless you become like these little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And so what is it? Thakur also talks about the purity of children, and he says that's why holy people surround themselves with children, love to surround themselves with children. And the reason's really pretty clear. One, they haven't that body identity has not firmly affixed in them. That happens at that glorious age of puberty, where the body-centered idea really kicks in for us, and we really identify with our body and with our gender. Whereas children are free from that. They don't have that deep identity with the body. And secondly, their attachments don't run deep. They have their attachments, but they can be coaxed out of them rather simply. And they're this way one time and this way another time. So they're very free in it. Thakur uses the example, they can get mad and get into a brutal fight, and 3 minutes later you come back in the room and they're hugging and playing with a doll together. It's like their anger, like the anger of a holy man, is like a line on the water. It doesn't run deep. So yes, that lack of attachment, that lack of body identity is really what's missing, what has not infected the children or not gotten into that idea, yet. So again, I think that's another way of seeing that's the manifestation of a lack of me and mine. It doesn't run deep. It certainly shows itself. You can you can certainly find kids that don't like their broccoli, refuse to eat it no matter what. But it's always childlike. There's still a quality about it that's not quite as serious as your husband refusing to eat his broccoli. That's anyway. All right. And so the last one here that he mentions is devotion, right? And devotion's an interesting thing. How would you define devotion? It seems to me that it's
like the surrendering to love, and faith is in there too.
Yes.
It's a faithful attachment.
Yeah. I think it ties almost all of our holy words together. Devotion is what happens when you recognize yourself to be in the presence of divine love. It's not a manufactured thing. It's a part of our true nature when it's presented with itself. When it becomes aware of itself, that devotion happens. And that devotion is a manifestation of our natural bliss. Devotion happens naturally when you become aware of awareness. It's when you become aware of God as God is love, and it's an unconditioned love, and it's an infinite love. And when you stand with faith in that, you trust it, you allow yourself to know it to be true, devotion happens. And devotion is a natural, it's exactly, devotion and worship are very close. Worship is what happens when you're in the presence of God. And devotion, I think, is the same. Devotion is that experience of self when in the presence of the divine, in the presence of faith in the divine.
Becomes real. Yeah.
Yes, yes. It betrays its realness. It's
Mhm.
always real, but
Right.
we become aware of its realness, of its actuality, and it changes our world, changes everything about us, actually. That's why holy people are so wonderful to be around. They've got a lot of joy in them, and seeing you makes them happier. Being around you makes them, brings out even more of that quality in themselves. And that's why we feel so loved by them, so nourished by them. So yeah, so devotion can manifest everywhere. The more you begin seeing God everywhere, you can know that you're going to be more devoted everywhere. You're going to take more careful care of the people in your life, your pets, your animals, your plants, even your house after a while. You do all of it out of devotion, think about, yeah. I just think about, in high school when I first started. One day I'll stop talking about these things because I always get such a hard time. The swamis always tell me, stop talking about those things. But those are the things that put me in the monastery. So I have a lot of, if I forget them, who knows if I could stay in a monastery, But this notion of devotion is gets so intense. I mean, look at Takore's emotion. Here's Greg. Greg thought it was at 7.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, so devotion. So those 3 things he wants us to have: faith, purity, and devotion. And the way to have those in the world, there's nothing that you can do to get them yourself. It's like getting a suntan. What you have to do is put yourself in the presence of the beloved, and to remember that presence always. And that presence, that thought and knowledge and faith in the presence of God, is what will, one, make you pure, because it will bring all of your need for anything within the self. You won't have to go out through the senses to get it. It will bring about that faith, because it will reinforce what that faith is in. And third, it'll give you that devotion, because you're in the presence of such a beautiful isness, beautiful nature of life. And all of those things together will just take you higher and deeper and deeper. You will never, ever, ever be able to understand the love of the beloved. You will never reach the end of it. Just when you think you will have fallen in love as deep and fully as you possibly could, Mother will open more. And that will go on forever. That will go on forever, because God is infinite. So your devotion, our devotion now, our bliss now, is just a taste. We enjoy it sometimes in prayer or in meditation or in a good song or a good worship service. And that seems like so much for us, and it keeps our life going. But in a million years, after you've realized God long, long ago, you're still at the beginning. That's why Brahmananda says, Nirvikalpa Samadhi is just the beginning of spiritual life. Because God's love is infinite. God's bliss is infinite, cannot be measured. And it will occupy you with ecstasy for all of eternity.
Swami, I want to ask a question, but it may be a question that might take the next few hours if you had to talk on it. But you just use the word you get faith and purity and devotion by staying in the presence of God.
Yes.
I wanted you to elaborate on what does it mean to stay in the presence of God?
Yeah, that's a moving target. It's not so much that we have to talk about it forever. It's just that there's so many
Yeah.
aspects of it that you could talk forever. But to be in the presence of God is really just an awareness of your own awareness. Stay aware of your own awareness, because God is what? Satchitananda, right? So God is that bliss or love. God is wisdom, and God is existence. Become aware of your existence and never stop thinking about it. Become aware of your bliss and never stop thinking about it. Never let the mind wander from it. Become aware of wisdom within you. So really, being in the presence of God is more working on our awareness. We tend to go to sleep. And what does that mean? We go into mind. We pay attention to our thoughts. That's not being present, right? Because like we talked about, your thoughts are behind time. Your thoughts are fully constructed from the past. So if you live in your mind, you're not awake. You're not present. You're not aware of who you are. You're not in the presence of the divine. Now, I say that metaphorically because there's no way to not be in the presence of God. But even with that impossibility, we spend most of our lives not aware of being in the presence of God. So that presence of God is manifested by wisdom, by your very existence, and by love. And so be freshly aware beyond thought. I think you can talk and empty your mind and be aware that you've emptied your mind. And in the awareness of an empty mind, you'll become aware of God. You become aware of these things as primary, not in thinking about them, but in experiencing them in real time, spontaneously. So that's why you can't think about it, because thinking about it takes you out of spontaneity, takes you out of the moment, takes you out of the I am, which is God, and it puts you into your imagined world, right? So it's to free yourself of thinking to that extent, to the extent that you're free of mind noise or mind thinking, to that extent you're in the presence of God. To that extent you enjoy his bliss, her bliss. To that extent you have spontaneous access to that infinite wisdom. And to that measure you're aware. To that measure you exist. You've opened to the whole. You've plugged into the immensity in the way that Ili Chiaro talks. You've put your tendrils into the immensity, the infinite self. Does that work at all for you as an idea?
Absolutely. This was very nice. Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Well, it's 7:00, 7:05. Once again, thank you for coming. Be well.
Namaste.
And
Thank
we'll
you
see
so
you
much, sir.
the next time. Jai Ma. All right.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Good evening,
Thank you,
everyone.
Swami.
I
Good
missed.
evening.
No worries. You're here. All right. Be well, everyone. Jai Ma, Jai Thakur, Jai
Jai Ma.
Swamiji.